Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. David Benatar. He is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Cape Town in Cape Town, South Africa. He is best known for his advocacy of anti-natalism in his book, Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence, in which he argues that coming into existence is a serious harm, regardless of the feelings of the existing being once brought into existence, and that, as a consequence, it is always morally wrong to create more sentient beings. He is also the author of books like The Second Sexism, Discrimination against Men and Boys, and The Human Predicament, a candid guide to life's biggest questions. So, Dr. David Benatar, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
My pleasure, and nice to speak with you.
Oh, it's always nice to speak with you, Dr. Benatar, as well. So, let me first ask you this. In your book, you make the case for anti-natalism. Could you please tell us briefly what is this position about, even though I've already gave a brief summary in the introduction?
Sure. Antinatalism is the view that it is wrong to bring new beings, and more specifically, new sentient beings into existence. The name is perhaps a little misleading because it refers to the birth of a being, and there may be differing views about when one comes into existence. Not everybody would say that it's at birth, but notwithstanding that slight inaccuracy in the name, it does refer to the view that we ought not to be creating new sentient beings.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so I guess that it would be good for us to get straight into one of the main arguments that you make in your book, that is the asymmetry argument. So, just not for me to get it incorrectly, could you please put it in your own words? What is the asymmetry argument?
So actually, I defend a number of asymmetries, but in Better Never to Have Been, there's a sort of foundational axiological asymmetry that I refer to, and that goes as follows. It says that the presence of pain is bad. So if you've got somebody who exists and they have some pain or they've got some other negative state, then that is going to be bad. The presence of pleasure or any other good thing is good.
Mm-hmm.
So that's fine. But when we come to the absence of pains, that I say, and other bad things, I say that's good. The absence of that is good, even if there's nobody who enjoys that good. Whereas the absence of good things is not bad, unless there is somebody for whom that absence is a deprivation. So the asymmetry really comes in with the absence of pain and pleasure. So if you've got an existing person and they're deprived of pain, that's going to be good. If you've got an existing person and they're deprived of pleasure, that's going to be bad. But if you've got a non-existing person, in other words, if somebody's not come into existence and they could have come into existence, then the absent pain is good, but the absent pleasure is not bad. So the asymmetry really kicks in when you're dealing about a being that could have been or could still be brought into existence and who is not brought into existence.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but now I would like to ask you, because there are a couple of things here that might sound a bit weird, at least to most people and people who are not really familiar with these positions like anti-natalism and things like that. Because, I mean, when you put forth that argument, aren't you, in a sense, trying to evaluate how non-existence would be from the point of view of someone who has already existed, at least for a certain period of time, and also vice versa, that you are trying to speculate about what would life have been for someone who never really got to exist? Or am I wrong here?
Don't think I'm doing that. So when we're considering bringing a being into existence, we do know that its life will contain some bad and, in ordinary circumstances, some good as well. So we don't know the precise proportions of each of those, but the proportions don't matter for this particular asymmetry. But we do know that because that's what lives typically contain, both good and bad. And now we're trying to evaluate whether the absence of that good and bad in a scenario when we don't bring that person into existence, whether the absence of those things is bad or good. And I want to say that if we don't bring this being into existence, the absence of the pain that it would otherwise have had is a good thing, but the absence of the pleasure is not a bad thing. And it's not a bad thing because there is nobody there to be deprived of it. So I don't think there's anything unduly speculative about this. We do know that lives are going to contain both good and bad, and now we're trying to make an evaluation of the absence of each of those.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so another issue that I personally find here is that at a certain point in your book, you refer to, let's say, the mental basis or the cognitive basis that people use to evaluate a life in terms of it being good or bad or being worth or not worth living and things like that. And you refer, for example, to the Pollyanna principle that is a sort of a bias that leads people to perhaps evaluate life much more positively than we would objectively evaluate it, let's say. But isn't it also the case that if we evaluate life positively or negatively, we're always doing so on the basis of the biases that we have evolved, that is the way our minds work innately and work so because they arrived at these mechanisms of evaluation through evolutionary processes and to solve certain evolutionary relevant problems to keep us alive and make us reproduce and things like that. And so if we are evaluating it either positively or negatively, isn't it always based on biases?
I think that's true, but our judgments can be inaccurate even if they are a result of some evolutionary background. So there are all kinds of illusions that we are familiar with. Think about the Liar-Muller line, where what two lines of equal length look different depending on how you put the arrows on the edge of them. Mm-hmm. Now, there may be a perfectly good evolutionary or other explanation as to why we have that illusion, but it doesn't mean that when we say the one line is longer than the other, or we perceive the one line to be longer than the other, that our judgment there is accurate. It's inaccurate, and we ought to recognize that although it appears one way, it's actually another way. And I would say, similarly, when it comes to our evaluations of the quality of our life, if there are these well-established biases, the fact that they have an evolutionary explanation doesn't mean that they're not biases. It doesn't mean that we're not making inaccurate judgments. So I would say we ought to take that into account when we're deciding whether to bring new beings into existence.
Yes, right. But I was not saying that they aren't biases. I'm just saying that even when we evaluate life or anything that happens in our lives negatively, we're basing that also on certain biases that we have evolved to consider certain things good and other things bad and certain things positive and other things negative. Because, for example, I also recall by reading psychology that we also have certain biases that predispose us toward negativity, like the negativity bias. That is, we tend to remember much more accurately bad or negative events in our lives and to recall them more easily, for example.
Actually, my understanding of the psychological literature is that it's more complicated than that, or that although there are some circumstances in which we recall the negative more than the positive, overall we actually recall the positive more than the negative. But I think there's a more general point that I want to make here, and that is that insofar as we are subject to negative biases that are skewing our judgments, I think those are also things that we need to correct for in our evaluations. So I don't deny that there are some people who have an overly pessimistic view about the quality of our life. They think that it's worse than it really is. These sort of people, I think, are aberrant. They're not the norm. The norm is to have the Pollyanna bias, to have the bias towards optimism. But there are some people who just have too grim a view about the way the world is. And I wouldn't want to trust their judgments either. I think that if we've got evidence that somebody is being too negative in their judgment, then we ought to correct for that. So the point that I'm making is not one that's true of every last human being. It's one that's true of humanity in general. So in general, we have the optimism bias, we have these other phenomena of accommodation, of comparison, and I argue in the book that the net effect of all of these is to give us a more positive view of the quality of our lives than we're warranted in having. But that's not to say that there are no people on earth who have too negative a view.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, but I think that another thing I was trying to say when I brought up these things about evolution and how our minds evolved and the biases we are predisposed to, both the negative and the positive and things like that. I guess that what I was trying to say as well, or the argument that I was trying to make, is also that perhaps we can't really objectively evaluate life because we're always under the effects of the biased ways that our mind evolved to consider certain aspects of life positive and others negative. Because, I mean, perhaps if we were to have evolved in different environments or in different ways for a reason or another, perhaps we would have considered other things positive and others negative, different than the ones that we do with the brains that we have. Am I being clearer or not?
Thanks. I think I'm getting your concern more clearly, but I would say two things in response here. Firstly, sometimes how we've evolved is actually objectively relevant to whether something is good for us or bad for us. So we humans don't have gills. We breathe in a way that involves air. So we have to get the oxygen through air rather than through water. And that means that if we find ourselves submerged in water, that's going to be very bad for us. Now, that's a product of our evolutionary background. But when we reach the conclusion that we need air rather than water in order to breathe in, there's nothing irrational about that. It's perfectly rational, even though it's got an evolutionary explanation. And something different would be true of fish, for example, who have gills rather than lungs, and they need to oxygenate themselves in a different way. And so, again, the evolutionary background doesn't mean that the judgment we make about what's good for a fish is irrational. So that's the one point I would make. But the other point I would make is that if we can't be entirely objective, that doesn't mean to say there's not a spectrum, and that in recognizing our biases, we can't get a more objective assessment of what's good for us or bad for us. So if we can recognize those biases, try to control for them, we could reach more objective judgments, even if they are not purely objective. I mean, after all, that's what science tries to do all the time. It's trying to control for all kinds of biases and all kinds of variables and get closer to an objective assessment of what's going on in the world. There's not the pretense there that we're going to do that perfectly, that we're going to attain perfect certain knowledge, just that we're going to do a much better job that way than if we just indulge whatever intuition we have.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so perhaps the issue here was more with the way you or I or other people use the word or define what is objective. Because, I mean, what you mean by objective here is something that is related to the ways we evaluate the world. Because, in other words, we can't really, through science, for example, through objective empirical ways, find values themselves in the world and discover what is good and what is bad by itself. I mean, outside of our evaluative processes or something like that.
Right. Well, here you're touching on a very old and fraught issue in philosophy, and more specifically in ethics, about the relationship between is and ought. Right. And what I would argue is that when we making ethical arguments, when we're making ethical evaluations, obviously there's going to be some small gap between what is and what ought to be, but we want to try to minimize that gap so that you're making reasonable starting points. So let's come back to the idea of needing oxygen to breathe, and we humans need that through the. Now, that's just a sort of scientific fact. Now, when we make the shift down, we say, well, look, air is good for us. Breathing through air is good for us, and breathing through water is bad for us. There's a sense in which that's a non-moral claim. We're just saying what it is that works for the organism or what doesn't work for the organism. It's a very small step from there to saying that, well, all things being equal, you shouldn't shove the head of a human underneath water and keep it there. So it's not that there's no step, but that it's a relatively small step, and a reasonable person can see why you would make that step from the scientific information. Mm-hmm. Now, there are obviously more complicated cases. So take, let's say, tobacco, for example, and smoking tobacco. There was a time when people thought that was actually good for you. We now know that it's bad for the organism. Now, depending on what the science of this matter is, you may reach different conclusions about whether you should be teaching your children to smoke and whether you should be taking up smoking yourself. In the face of evidence or purported evidence that this is good for you, you might think, well, there's quite a good argument here that we ought to take this up and teach our children to smoke. In the face of the overwhelming evidence that we now have that these things cigarette smoking is very bad for us, well, it's a really small step to the conclusion that this is not something you should be teaching your children to do. So again, I'm not arguing that there's no gap between the is and the ought, but we want to try to minimize that in order to make good ethical arguments, and I think we can often do that.
Okay, but I think the cases that you gave as examples are pretty straightforward. But when we're evaluating life in general, how can we really, let's say, measure what is the threshold beyond which, for example, if we feel pain beyond a certain threshold, that no amount of pleasure can compensate for it, or how do we measure pain and pleasure and determine that if we have this X amount of pain and this Y amount of pleasure, then life is not worth living, or vice versa?
So I think here what you're shifting is from an objective assessment to a precise assessment. And I agree with you that we can't have precision here. If you want to have a particular number put on the badness of pain and a particular number put on the goodness of pleasure and then do a comparison, we can't get that level of precision. I'm not suggesting that we can or that we should. I'm simply saying that we can make more objective judgments about this than we ordinarily do. They may not be super precise, but they might be precise enough to reach certain conclusions.
Okay.
So I would never presume to say to somebody, let's imagine we had an existing person and they looked like they were suffering terribly, let's say, from a terminal disease. I would never presume to say to that person, look, I think it's reached the point now where it's better for you to die, and so I'm going to take your life. If that's a competent person, that's a decision they need to make. And they may be wrong about the judgment that they make. They may think their life is worth continuing when it's not, but I can't claim to have better access to the relevant data than they do, and so I would leave that decision up to them. But when we're creating a new being, we're in a different sort of situation entirely. Then we can't consult that being. And so we need to try to make those judgments as objectively as we can, even though they can't be super precise.
Mm-hmm. And what would be some of the ways to trying to arrive at that objectivity in terms of determining really if life in general, for humans and other sentient beings as well, of course, is not worth living?
Right. I think I want to say a few things in response to that question. The first is that you've used that phrase, a life worth living. And one of the things that I do in the book is to disambiguate that phrase. So I think a life worth living could mean either a life worth continuing, or it could mean a life worth starting. And those mean two different things, and I think we should apply different standards in making those different judgments. In other words, there's a different standard to decide whether a life is worth starting to deciding whether a life is worth continuing. So there's an ambiguity in your question, and I think that for our purposes, what we're interested in is a life worth starting. If we were talking about euthanasia or assisted suicide or something of that kind, then we'd be interested in lives worth continuing. But we're interested in this context of procreation in lives worth starting. And there, the actual relative amounts of good and bad in a life are in one sense moot, because if you accept that axiological asymmetry that I was describing a few moments ago, then it doesn't really matter how much bad and good there is in a life, so long as there is some quantity of good. The axiological asymmetry is going to produce the conclusion that we ought not to be creating the new being, because whatever bad would be in that life, that can be avoided, and that's good. And whatever good there would be in that life, the absence of that is not bad. So the equation is always going to come out against procreation. The amounts of good and bad that there are in a life are really relevant to the question about how bad coming into existence is. And that, I think, would vary from person to person. Or if you rejected the axiological asymmetry, then I have other kinds of asymmetry arguments for the badness of life, and then the relative amounts would be relevant. The relevant amounts of good and bad would be relevant. So I'm sorry, that's a lot of preamble to the question. I could go on and answer it within the framework I've just delineated, but I did want to clarify that the relative amounts are not inherently relevant to the argument that I've so far outlined.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no problem. That was good. And since you referred to the distinction between evaluating if a life is worth continuing or if a life is worth starting, aren't there at least certain points where the two things touch? Because, just to give you an example, isn't it also the case that people who already exist, because they take as a good to reproduce, that there's a point where the two things intersect? Because I mean, in a certain way, if you were to determine or to decide, or even if we as a species were to decide that we would not reproduce anymore, then perhaps there would be, I'm not saying that all people would be frustrated by that, because there are certain people that are really not that interested in reproducing, but at least for the people that already exist, many of them, we would be reducing significantly the quality of the lives that they already have by impelling them, let's say, to not reproduce, to not create a new life.
Right. Well, first to clarify, I'm not wanting to impel anybody. So one of the things in the book is I'm not trying to compel anybody, coerce anybody. I think that would have all kinds of negative effects. So I'm really offering a prescription for people who want to evaluate this argument and who are convinced by it. Then it's a personal decision for them and their partner, perhaps if there is a partner, to desist from procreation. Now, when you say these two ideas come together, well, they come together in a way in that somebody's deciding that starting a life is going to make their continued life better, but they still remain separate questions. In other words, the question about whether a life is worth starting and whether your life is worth continuing if you don't start a life, those are separate questions. So you need to evaluate those questions separately. And I don't deny that a life without children will be worse for some people than a life with children, but that doesn't mean to say that the questions collapse into one another.
Yes, but since we're talking about ethics and life ethics in this case, and we're trying to decide objectively, even though, as you're saying, we're not compelling here people to do one thing or the other, but since it has ethical strength, let's say, if we were to determine objectively that it would not be good to bring new people to life, then that in a way would by itself, I mean, make people feel bad in a certain way, because I mean, when it comes to ethical or moral arguments, in a way we are referring to people's decisions and people's values, and that really touches on very deep and profound aspects of humanity. I mean, do you get what I'm trying to say here?
Yes, but I don't deny that there's going to be a sacrifice for some people in not having children. The question is whether that's a sacrifice that's warranted or not. So we can think about other clear cases where there wouldn't be controversy, at least now and between us. Let's imagine there's a slaveholder, and we're asking that slaveholder to free his or her slaves. And they say, well, look, this would involve a certain cost to me, because now I would have to do all the work that the slaves are doing. I wouldn't have that luxury in my life. And we say, yeah, no, we understand that. We understand that it's going to involve some cost to you, but you're just not justified in inflicting this cost on your slaves. And I would say something similar about procreation. If you're wanting to bring into existence a being that is going to suffer and then die, because every child you have is going to die, and usually not in a pleasant way. As I say, it never ends well. Lives never end well. You always end up dying. If you're going to create a being that's going to be destined to have that, and you're doing that for your own gratification, you may not be warranted in doing that. And then we can acknowledge the cost to you without thinking that undermines the conclusion.
Right. And do you think that if we are to, little by little, as we seem to be doing, improve our environments, that is the quality of life for most of humanity through technology and other types of achievements, do you think that if we can create or improve the little by little, of course, the best environments for people to live in, that makes any difference in terms of deciding if it's good or bad to bring new people into existence?
I don't think it does, and I think it doesn't for a few reasons. The one is that even if we could bring about these changes, let's imagine in 100 years' time or 200 years' time, lives would be much better than they are now. There'll still be intervening generations of people who will suffer quite considerably until then. And it seems to me indecent to be inflicting that existence on people in the hope that down the line you're going to have these significant improvements. Think about an analogy. Let's imagine somebody in perhaps 1500 is contemplating whether to have a child. And they know that if they have that child, if that child ever has toothache or needs a limb amputated or needs some other surgery, they're going to have this procedure done without anesthetic. Of course, they don't have the concept of anesthesia at the time, but they may have the idea of being numb to pain. And let's imagine the optimist in 1500 says, well, maybe that sometime down the line a drug will be invented which would enable one to have this procedure performed without being aware of it at the time. Well, there's a long time between 1500 and 1840 or 50, I can't remember what year exactly anesthetics were discovered. And that's a lot of people who are going to be born and subjected to surgery without the benefit of anesthesia. If you think you're justified in procreating in those few hundred years until the discovery of anesthesia, I'd say you're very much mistaken. And similarly, if we could make similar advances between now and a few hundred years' time, I don't think we're justified in doing that. But the deeper problem is that I don't think we're ever going to expunge serious harm from people's lives. There'll always be something that gets us. So, for example, advances in healthcare and in environmental conditions have led in some parts of the world, not all, in some parts of the world, to a reduction in death from infectious diseases. But in those parts of the world, people now die of malignancies, of neurodegenerative diseases, which bring their own unpleasantness. There's a terrible ways to die. People die later, but they still die awfully. And if we now find a cure for cancer and find a way to cure these neurodegenerative diseases, there'll be something else that gets people. And that's because I think that unpleasantness and suffering is deeply inscribed in the structure of sentient life. I can't imagine how we're going to entirely avoid that.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that it would make sense for us to try another path different from what you're putting forth here, and trying to be utilitarian in the sense that, for example, let's say that we are noticing that we're making progress, even if it's by little steps, in terms of elevating humanity, in terms of quality of life, and fighting certain types of diseases, and with time we would be able to also prevent or treat the other ones and things like that. And would it make sense for us to think that, okay, so let's say that we would have all of these life tribulations still until 1,000 years from now, but after that all people that would be brought into the world would be able to live in an environment where the negativity of life, the negative things in life would be reduced to virtually zero. And after that, humanity would still exist, let's say, for millions and millions of years, since there would be many more people that would have lived in those new circumstances and would have had a really worth and fulfilling life. Does that make a good case for continuing reproducing? Or
I don't think so, because I think there's just so much speculation there. Those are all uncertainties, whereas when you're considering whether to produce a child, it's pretty much a certainty that if you have it, it's going to have bad things befall it. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think that's, I don't think, for the reasons I outlined earlier, I think that's far too optimistic in addition to being too speculative.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And let's go back to the lives of people who already exist, because I've already touched on the point of making at least many people more miserable by them not reproducing, let's say. But I guess that another point would be that perhaps if people were to suddenly stop reproducing, then for the people that already exist, at least in the long run, and in the long run from the perspective of the normal duration of a human life, let's put it that way, then probably their lives later at least would also be more miserable, in the sense that if we had too few people to support those people that already existed in their later lives when they were already old, then that wouldn't that be a problem or not?
It would, and in fact I considered that very outcome in the book and discussed how we would cope with it. But I do have to note that that is really a hypothetical scenario. If we're looking at reality, it's not going to be the case that all humans decide not to procreate any longer, and that we'll then have a final generation of people on the basis of this mass voluntary decision. That's not what's going to happen. Instead, what's going to happen is either more or fewer people are going to decide to procreate. And so I'm not expecting the whole of humanity to be converted to this idea. What I would hope is that there will be individuals and couples who will decide on the basis of these arguments not to produce children, and they will be sparing immense amounts of suffering as a result of doing that. But because the implication of my view is that everybody ought to stop procreating, I did have to consider the eventuality that people would act on that. And then I considered this final generation where there are no offspring, no younger generation to be providing all kinds of benefits for the older people. And I agree, that would be a horrific scenario. But that's a scenario that is very likely to come in any event, because there will be a final generation of people. We don't quite know how humanity will end. So it might be that it's a cataclysmic end and everybody is killed at a fireball in an instant or over a relatively short period of time, or whether it will be the case that the planet will become increasingly inhospitable and there'll be fewer and fewer people reproducing, and then there will be an older generation without a younger generation to support them. We don't know which of these scenarios will eventually result. But what we do know is there will be a final generation and that things are going to be pretty awful at that point. And so what we're really deciding about is, should that come sooner or should it come later? And if you take seriously the amount of suffering that there is for sentient beings, I would argue it's better if it came earlier rather than later, all things being equal.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say about ideas or proposals that come from certain people when they say that, okay, of course we have pain and suffering and negative things that happen in our lives, or most of the time, or all of the time, or at least we have them always in our lives to a certain extent, let's put it that way. But those people say that we can develop mental tools to deal with those things and to turn them into positive ones, or at least to make us psychologically stronger in a way that allows for us to have, if not happy lives, at least fulfilling ones.
Well, thanks. I'm pleased you asked that, because a lot of people do have that sort of question. And I don't want to deny that through some adversity, some people do grow. I don't want to deny that. I just want to deny that inflicting the adversity could be justified by the growth that some people have as a result. So let's imagine that somebody who is raped or is tortured, through that process, as a result of that process, comes to grow in various ways because they begin to do good things, let's say to address that kind of problem in the world. None of that would justify anybody raping or torturing the person in the first place. And I would say similarly that when you create a child, you bring it into existence and you make possible all the suffering that it will experience, the fact that some good might come of that doesn't justify the act of procreation in the first place. And in any event, it would be very odd to say, I want to bring about a being so that it will suffer and then grow, because that growth would be good, if you consider the axiological asymmetry, because the absence of that good, the good that comes from the growth through adversity, wouldn't be bad if the person never exists in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Right. And when now moving on to talking a little bit about non-human animals. So since we as humans can't really have access to how other animals experience life, how can we then objectively determine that not bringing into existence non-human animals would also be a net positive for them?
Well, again, let me clarify that I think we've got limited control over animal procreation. We have more control over domesticated animals and agricultural animals, so we can decide whether to have our companion animals breed or be neutered or spayed. We can decide whether or not to breed agricultural animals, cows, sheep, goats, things that are animals that are used for food and other for their meat and their products. But for most wild animals, we don't really have control over whether they procreate or not. So that's just a sort of background thing we need to be aware of. But again, I would say with respect to evaluating these lives, although we can't be precise, we can make relatively objective judgments. So think about dogs that are brought into existence, let's say by these puppy mills that produce large numbers of puppies to sell to pet shops. Well, a lot of those animals are reared in very unfortunate circumstances in the early part of their lives. Many of them are so-called euthanized later on because there isn't enough demand for them all. And if you look at stray dogs that are often very suffering from all kinds of diseases and insufficient food, and even animals that are so-called cared for by humans, but are actually abused by humans, maltreated by humans, we can look at these animals and say, this is not a good life. In fact, this is the very sort of judgment that people make when they do come to euthanize an animal. Let's imagine your companion animal has reached the end of its life and it's suffering from a malignancy. Many people decide, and I would argue quite reasonably, that it is not in this animal's interest to continue living, and then you might resort to euthanasia. Now, those judgments are hard ones to make. At what point has the animal now reached when its life is no longer worth continuing? How do you know when that point is? Well, there's no precision here, but we can make reasonable judgments and less reasonable judgments about these matters. So again, I would say there's something objective about it, even though we can't be precise.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now let's move on to more specific topics and the implications that anti-natalism might have to certain ethical issues and also how it connects with other problems. So first, about abortion. What sort of implications do you think it could have for deciding when or in what circumstances someone should go for abortion or not?
So my view is that antinatalism by itself doesn't entail any view about abortion. Antinatalism is simply the view that we ought not to bring new beings into existence. There's then a question about when somebody comes into existence in the relevant way. So let's imagine you thought that somebody comes into existence in the relevant way at conception. Then you would say, well, if you're aborting somebody, you're now killing them. They already exist, and it's too late to prevent them from coming into existence. So now the question is not one of an antinatalist kind. If, on the other hand, you're an antinatalist and you hold the view that we don't come into existence at conception, we come into existence, let's say, at some later point in gestation, then antinatalism combined with this view would entail that abortion prior to the point where you come into existence would be morally required, because that would be a way to prevent the being from coming into existence. So the general point is that antinatalism by itself doesn't entail any view about abortion, but antinatalism combined with some views about when we come into existence does have implications for abortion.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I think that about suicide, it's also really interesting because you've already told us here that antinatalism doesn't advocate for suicide, of course, but on the other hand, suicide is directly associated with death. And in your book, you refer to death as another thing that if someone is brought into existence, it also brings more pain to their existence because they are living and suddenly their existence is interrupted, and that's also something that really brings negative feelings and suffering for people, both for the one whose life has terminated and for all the people around her, let's say. So in that sense, since death is something negative, even though antinatalism doesn't advocate for suicide, would it be possible to use antinatalism to make an argument against suicide?
Well, again, antinatalism per se, I think, doesn't have any implication for suicide, because antinatalism is a view about bringing people into existence, and it says we ought not to do that. But there's a separate question about when, if ever, it's better to go out of existence. Now, you're correct that I do think that death is a bad. It's something bad that befalls us. It needn't be because we experience death. We can experience dying, but death itself, obviously, we can't experience. But it can be bad in other ways. It can be bad because of the good it deprives us of, and it can be bad because it annihilates us. It brings about the end of the self. And so I think that is one of the bad things about life. But that's not to say that suicide is never warranted, because although death is bad, I think there are some fates that are worse than death. So it may be that the quality of life can become so awful that even though you've got an interest in continuing to exist, your interest in avoiding the suffering overrides your interest in continuing to exist. And then it may well be that suicide is warranted. So I do think that suicide is sometimes both rational and morally permissible, but not always by any means.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that people themselves, that it is, I'm not sure if legitimate is the right word to use here, but that people by themselves can decide if their lives are not really worth continuing, and then if it's really good or bad for them to commit suicide at a certain point in their lives, or that other people might also have a word to say about it?
I don't think that we are always the best judges of these matters. I've certainly known people whose decision to take their own lives has been perfectly rational. And then I've known other people who've taken their lives and I believe that their decision is irrational. So I don't think that as somebody contemplating suicide is always in the best position. And although people may think they are absolutely right that taking their life would be the right thing, they can't be sure of that. If they're suffering from some kind of cognitive bias in the reverse direction, they may be overestimating how bad things are or underestimating the good in their lives. And so I would think that having a conversation with a confidant who could give an external perspective, with whom one could discuss these matters in a serious way, that would be desirable, and that one should take seriously what that external person would say. In general, my view is that suicide is reasonable when you're in extremis, but for the ordinary problems of life, it's not an appropriate solution because of the heavy costs attached to death.
Mm-hmm. So in that sense, would you say that, for example, if someone were to go through a longer period of suffering than she would have been through if she decided to put an end to their life right then and there, and if after that longer period of suffering they would get to a better point in life, that it would be worth continuing their life?
Those are difficult cases to know. So there's a famous case of this kind. Are you familiar with the case of Donald Cowart, who was
I don't think so.
He was terribly burnt all over his body, and he wanted to refuse the medical treatment that the doctors were forcing on him for this because it was so painful. And eventually he got to the point where he no longer wanted to die. He'd gone through the worst of the treatment. He'd established a quality of life that he was comfortable with. And he was asked, do you not think now that the doctors did the right thing in overriding your wishes and forcing treatment on you that you didn't want? And his answer, quite reasonably, was that, no, I don't think the doctors did the right thing. It's perfectly reasonable for me now, once those costs have already been paid, to want to continue living. But it was not worth my enduring that. So if I could go back in time and know that I was going to endure what I had to endure, I would rather have avoided that. Now, that's a fairly clear case because of just the severity of his wounds and how much suffering was involved. It doesn't seem to me it would have been irrational to elect not to have treatment in that case. But there'll be other scenarios where it's much harder to judge. But I don't think that the mere fact that you will eventually get through the pain and suffering means that the pain and suffering is warranted. It might not be.
Mm-hmm. Yes, this is very interesting because, as you said, antinatalism doesn't directly say anything about these matters, but on the other hand, since to put forth this philosophy of antinatalism, we have to evaluate really if life is worth living or not, in a sense, or if it has more pain or more pleasure associated with it. I think that we can also use that framework, let's say, to make a case for other situations, like, for example, if someone is suffering from a terrible terminal disease, and if it would be right or wrong for us to perform euthanasia in them. I mean, what are your ideas about the implications that this framework of evaluating life might have for euthanasia?
So again, I don't think that antinatalism itself has implications, although some of the background arguments for antinatalism might have some implications. And we've not explored yet the empirical asymmetries that I think there are between the bad and the good. Mm-hmm. So, for example, I think there's much more pain than there is good, much more pain than there is pleasure in life. And so there's a variety of evidence we can muster for that. Just think about how there is a phenomenon called chronic pain, but there's no phenomenon called chronic pleasure. You can have chronic satisfaction, but matching that would be chronic dissatisfaction. So when it comes to the pains and pleasures, pains can go on for much longer than pleasures go on. Now, pains also tend to be worse than pleasures are good. If you think about the worst pains that there are, those are much more awful than the best pleasures are good. And if you want to test that, you can ask people, you can say, well, would you experience, let's say, an hour of the worst torments imaginable to human beings in exchange for, let's say, an hour and a half of the most pleasurable delights? And I don't think that anybody thinking rationally about this would take a deal of that kind, even though they were getting a longer period of pleasure. And that's just because the pain is so much worse than the pleasure is good. If you think how quickly bad things can happen to us, it takes a lifetime to learn certain things, and that can all be lost in an instant with a blow to the head or a fall. Think about how quickly injury occurs and how slow recovery takes place, if it takes place at all. There are all these metrics that we can use to show how the bad in life is going to predominate over the good. And that is going to be relevant to our assessments of the quality of our lives. But it's not going to be determinative of them.
Mm-hmm. And are there any other empirical metrics for us to use to determine, as you say, if there's really, if pain predominates over pleasure in life?
Yes, so I gave you some with respect to pain and pleasure. So it's the duration, it's the intensity, those sorts of things. But let's imagine we don't use a hedonistic basis for assessing quality of life. Let's imagine we use a desire satisfaction basis. Well, then I'd say we always have more desires than we have fulfilled desires. So if you take the full set of desires, only some subset of that is going to be fulfilled. And so there's always going to be some increment of some balance of unfulfilled desires. When your desires are fulfilled, you don't tend to remain satisfied because either a new desire of the same kind will emerge or a different desire will emerge. So again, if you look at these sorts of things, you see that they're going to, the equation of desire satisfaction is not going to come out very favorable. If you use objective list assessments of the quality of life, let's imagine you say, well, knowledge is a good thing. It's better to have more knowledge rather than less. Well, think on a spectrum from knowing nothing to knowing everything. Where do we fall? We fall very close to the knowing nothing end of the spectrum. If you think that longevity, let's say in good health, is a good thing, and you think about the spectrum from living for a second to living for eternity, where do we fall on that spectrum? Well, very close to the minimalist end. So whichever metric you use for assessing quality of life, it seems like there's an empirical asymmetry between the good and the bad.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And now let's just talk about another topic, that is, in what ways can antinatalism, or the arguments put forth for antinatalism, can connect with environmentalism, in the sense that, in the sense of making a case against bringing more people to the world, and issues related to overpopulation because of the destruction that humans are doing on the planet?
Thanks. Yes, so I have advanced both what I call philanthropic and misanthropic arguments for antinatalism. So philanthropic arguments are arguments of the kind I've been outlining already and which we've been discussing so far. These are arguments which focus on the being that's brought into existence and the interests of that being in not coming into existence. In other words, we're concerned about the harm done to the being that we bring into existence. Misanthropic arguments are ones where you're worried about the negative effects that the being you bring into existence will have on others, other human beings, other animals. And the environmental argument, I think, falls into that category. So it is true that when you bring a new child into existence, that child is going to, one way or another, do quite a bit of harm. Depends, of course, where in the world the child is born and other details of the lifestyle of that child. But if you think a child born into the developed world, it's going to be quite a high consumer. It's going to impact negatively on the environment in a variety of ways. And you can avoid that by not having the child. In fact, one of the biggest things you can do to reduce your carbon footprint is not have a child, because you are saving all the carbon footprints of that child, and in a way also of that children's further offspring. Mm-hmm. So there is a strong environmental argument. Now, this argument is not as categorical as the philanthropic argument, because let's imagine many people operated on this environmentalist argument and curtailed their procreative behavior, and we eventually got the human population back down to the sort of levels that it was on for most of human history. In other words, we're not talking about billions of people, but only millions of people. Well, then it might be that perhaps combined with some other technological advances that we have would mean that humans were not having the negative environmental impact that they are. Well, at that point, the environmentalist argument could no longer be used to individuals not to produce offspring. So it's not as categorical an argument as the philanthropic one.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just one last question. We've already talked a lot about other things, that perhaps arguments that people might put forth against anti-natalism, in the sense that, in a way, bringing more people to the world would also render the lives of people who already exist better and more worth living, let's say. But would you be willing to consider the argument of that if there's more people, it seems at least that just with higher numbers, people are able to accelerate innovation and improve the lives of more and more people in an incremental way? Would you consider that argument or not?
I think it's true in a way and not true in other ways. So if you think about the vast mass of humanity that is actually living in deprived conditions, while in principle there might be a source for innovation, they're actually deprived of the conditions which enable them to innovate in the ways that you're envisaging. So more and more starving children in the third world is not going to be a pool for innovation from those people. And then even in the developed world, although it is true that the larger the pool you have, the more opportunity you'd have to tap into, let's say, innovative potential. But on the other hand, the more people that you have, the more impact there is on the environment and on other people negatively. So you've got to weigh up the benefits you just speculated about with the costs, which are more certain. So I'm not denying the point entirely, but I'm saying it has to be viewed with a certain skepticism. It's got to be balanced against other considerations.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Benatar, just before we go, apart from the books I've already referred to in the introduction, are there any good places on the internet where people can go if they want to learn more about your work?
I'm not really sure about that. I know on my department website there is a list of, it's an incomplete list, but there is a list of publications, so people could access that. But otherwise, I would recommend for fairly concise statements of these views, the two books, Better Never to Have Been and The Human Predicament.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Benatar, it was really a pleasure to have you on the show. I think it was really a fascinating conversation about a topic that is really controversial, and I think it's really important for people to also get in contact with these ideas, even though most of them might not like them at least at first sight. But again, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show, and perhaps in the future we could do another interview, perhaps on another of your books.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for your interest, and I'd be happy to have another conversation with you on another occasion.
Okay. Or about your work?
I'm not really sure about that. I know on my department website there is a list of, it's an incomplete list, but there is a list of publications, so people could access that. But otherwise, I would recommend for fairly concise statements of these views, the two books, Better Never to Have Been and The Human Predicament.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Benatar, it was really a pleasure to have you on the show. I think it was really a fascinating conversation about a topic that is really controversial, and I think it's really important for people to also get in contact with these ideas, even though most of them might not like them at least at first sight. But again, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show, and perhaps in the future we could do another interview, perhaps on another of your books.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for your interest, and I'd be happy to have another conversation with you on another occasion.
Okay.